A hotel clerk opens a leather ledger. A man in a heavy coat writes a name that is not his own. He hands back the pen and walks upstairs to a room he does not own, in a country that is not his, under a title no state on earth still recognizes. This is how some of the most famous rulers in history actually died. Not on battlefields, not on scaffolds, in rented rooms, under false names. Their portraits hang in national museums, but the last signature each of them ever wrote was somebody else's. 8 men, 8 rooms, 8 names that were not theirs. They ruled empires that filled schoolroom maps in blue and gold. They stamped their profiles on coins that entire continents carried in their pockets. And then, one by one, they signed themselves out of history, using names their own subjects would not have recognized. Number 8 begins in the winter of 1688, on a small boat crossing the English Channel at night, with a Catholic king running from his own son-in-law. His name was James II of England and 7th of Scotland. He had ruled the 3 kingdoms for less than 4 years. Now his nephew and son-in-law, William of Orange, had landed at Torbay with a Dutch army of 14,000 men, and half the English aristocracy had switched sides in a single week. James threw the Great Seal of the realm into the River Thames as he fled. Without the seal, no royal document could be legally issued. He was destroying his own kingship on the way out. He reached France in December 1688. Louis XIV, his cousin, took him in. Louis gave him the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, the old royal residence west of Paris. It was not a rental. It was not a purchase. It was a French royal palace, loaned to a deposed English king for as long as he needed it. James moved in with his wife and infant son and reconstituted what was left of his court in exile. Officially, he was still king. In England, Parliament had declared the throne vacant, invited William and Mary to take it as joint monarchs, and quietly deleted him from the succession. He tried to come back. In 1689, he landed in Ireland with French troops and marched north. William met him at the River Boyne in July 1690 and defeated him decisively. James returned to Saint-Germain and never left again. For the next 11 years, he lived in a French royal palace as the King of England, using a title no English document would recognize, writing letters that no English court would accept as valid. His signature was legally meaningless the moment he crossed the Channel. He died on the 16th of September 1701 of a brain hemorrhage in the chateau at Saint-Germain. He was 67. His body was placed in a triple sarcophagus and stored, unburied, in an English Benedictine chapel in Paris, in the belief that it would one day be returned to England. It never was. During the French Revolution, the chapel was broken into and the body disappeared. To this day, no one knows where James II is buried. In 1824, an urn containing part of his remains was rediscovered during a church renovation in Saint-Germain-en-Laye and quietly reburied. It is the only physical trace of him that still exists in a marked grave. The last Catholic king of England was scattered across France in fragments in a country that never called him king out loud. James II died in a borrowed palace under a name his own country no longer recognized. But the next monarch died in something even stranger, an Austrian aristocrat's country house, under a title invented that week to get him through customs. Number 7 begins in the port of Portsmouth, England, in the autumn of 1830, with the wrong flags flying. The man stepping off the packet steamer had been anointed at Reims 5 years earlier in the oldest ceremony France still remembered. Holy oil, the royal touch, bishops in gold. He was Charles X. He was 73 years old, the last brother of Louis XVI, and he had just lost France in 3 days. His July ordinances had triggered barricades. The army had refused to fire. By the 3rd day, he was signing an abdication that Parliament ignored. The Duke of Wellington sent word from London. Britain would receive the Bourbons on one condition. They had to arrive as private citizens. Charles VI of France would enter Britain as the Count of Ponthieu. Ponthieu was a small coastal region with no real title attached to any land he owned. It was an ink stroke on a British passport invented that week. He signed for it because he had no choice. Crowds on the quay waved the tricolor flag at him, the flag of the revolution his family had spent 40 years trying to erase. The Bourbons moved from Lulworth Castle to Holyrood in Edinburgh to Prague Castle, borrowed from the Austrian emperor until the new emperor Ferdinand wanted the palace for his own coronation. Seeking warmer air for his failing health, Charles traveled south to Görz on the Mediterranean coast of the Austrian Empire, today Gorizia, on the border of Italy and Slovenia. An Austrian family, the Coronini-Kronbergs, offered him their palace. He arrived in October 1835. 2 weeks later, cholera reached him. He was dead by the 6th of November 1836 in a foreign bedroom in a house belonging to strangers under the invented title of a French county he did not own. The townspeople of Görz, who had known him only as the elderly Count of Ponthieu, draped their windows in black. France did not send anyone. His family buried him in the Franciscan monastery of Kostanjevica on a hill above the town in what is today Slovenia. He is the only king of France buried outside France. Every attempt to bring his body back to Saint-Denis has been quietly blocked by his own descendants. The false name has become the resting name. Number 6 begins on a platform at Wilhelmshohe Castle in Hesse in the spring of 1871, where a man in a plain civilian coat is boarding a train under British diplomatic supervision. He has been a prisoner of war for 195 days. His name is Charles Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. 7 months earlier, he was Emperor of the French. In Britain, he will not be Napoleon III. He will be a private citizen. That is the legal condition of his asylum. He arrived in England on the 20th of March 1871 and traveled by ordinary first-class rail to Chislehurst, a village in Kent. His wife Eugenie was waiting at a Georgian country house called Camden Place. The French flag was flying. A small imperial court had already reassembled itself around her. Camden Place had been bought in 1860 by Nathaniel Strode, who had known Louis Napoleon during earlier exiles. In 1862 and 1864, Strode received 900,000 francs from the French civil list and used the money to remodel the house in the French style. When the empire fell in 1870, Camden Place was ready. Napoleon III was renting a house his own empire had already paid for. Queen Victoria came to visit. So did the Tsar of Russia. His son was being educated to become Napoleon IV. Officially, the man of the house was a private British resident. Practically, the family was still running a government in waiting. On the 9th of January 1873, during a second operation to break his bladder stones, he died. He asked the surgeon whether the French had fought bravely at Sedan. Those were his last recorded words. Camden Place today is the clubhouse of Chislehurst Golf Club. The bedroom where he died is still there. Napoleon III, at least, died as himself, in the circle that still recognized him. The next man had already stopped calling himself by his real name 18 years before he died, and the alias he chose was so ordinary that the English-speaking world uses it as a placeholder for anonymous. Number 5 begins in the small hours of the 24th of February 1848 at the door of a Paris hackney cab. A tall, heavy man in a plain overcoat helps an elderly woman into the carriage. They have agreed on aliases for the ride. The man is Mr. Smith. The woman is Mrs. Smith. In the archives of French history, the man in the cab is Louis Philippe I, King of the French, 17.5 years into a reign of 35 million subjects. They are running from a revolution 3 days old, and the safest name they can use, at the moment of losing France, is the most anonymous name in the English language. Louis Philippe had come to the throne in 1830 by pushing Charles VI aside. He was known as the Citizen King. He walked in Paris without guards. He carried an umbrella. He had chosen the title King of the French rather than King of France to signal that he ruled by consent, not by divine right. The economy collapsed in 1846 and 1847. When the government banned a reform banquet in February 1848, Paris exploded. By the 24th, the National Guard was refusing to fire. Louis Philippe abdicated in favor of his young grandson and left the Tuileries by a side door. The crowds broke in behind him. His throne was carried across Paris on the shoulders of workers and burned in the Place de la Bastille. He reached the coast, boarded a boat to England under the name Mr. Smith, and landed at Newhaven on the 3rd of March 1848. Queen Victoria offered him Claremont, a large neoclassical house in Surrey. It was not sold to him. It was not rented to him. It was, in the discreet British formulation, put at his disposal. He took the incognito title Comte de Nolly after his private chateau in the western suburbs of Paris, which had been sacked and burned during the Revolution. He watched Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the nephew of the man his family had helped defeat, win the French presidency in December 1848 and then crown himself emperor 3 years later. He died at Clermont on the 26th of August 1850, aged 76. His body remained in England for 26 years. When it was finally returned to France in 1876, it was not interred at Saint-Denis. It lies in the Chapelle Royale at Dreux, the private Orléans mausoleum. In death, as in the last night of his reign, he stayed on the family's side of the line, not the country's. In France, an ex-king could call himself Smith. In Austria, at the end of the First World War, a man who had inherited 640 years of continuous Habsburg imperial rule found that he could not call himself anything at all. Number 4 begins on a rain-soaked pier at Funchal, Madeira, on the 19th of November, 1921, where 2 Austro-Hungarian officers in threadbare civilian coats disembark from a British cruiser under armed guard. The taller of the two is 34 years old. His name on the papers the British hand to the Portuguese Port Authority is simply Karl Habsburg. No style, no majesty. 5 years earlier, he had been crowned Emperor of Austria in Vienna and King of Hungary in Budapest, wearing the Iron Crown of St. Stephen and swearing an oath that dated to the year 1000. He was Karl I. He had inherited the throne in November 1916 at the age of 29. His great-uncle Franz Joseph had ruled for 68 years. Karl ruled for 2. When the war ended in November 1918, the empire dissolved in a single month. Czechs declared independence. Hungarians declared independence. Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes declared independence. 50 million subjects walked away. On the 11th of November 1918, Karl signed a document at Schönbrunn renouncing all participation in state affairs. He was advised to avoid the word abdication. He never signed one. In his mind, he remained the emperor. On the 3rd of April 1919, the new Austrian parliament passed the Habsburg Law. It exiled the entire dynasty. It confiscated their property. It abolished their titles. His identity had not been deposed. It had been legislated out of existence. He tried twice to reclaim the Hungarian throne in 1921. Both attempts failed. The Allies picked Madeira for his final exile because it was in the middle of the Atlantic and easily guarded. Karl and Zita spent their first weeks at Reed's Palace Hotel, the most expensive establishment on the island. The bill grew impossible to pay. A local banking family offered them a summer villa 2,000 feet up the mountain, called Quinta do Monte. It was unheated. The walls were damp. The plaster grew mold. In February 1922, the 6 Habsburg children arrived, and Zita was pregnant with the 8th. To feed them, Karl was quietly selling the crown jewels of the Habsburg dynasty through a Swiss dealer named Alphonse de Sondheimer. The Habsburg regalia was being converted into groceries in a mountain villa in the Atlantic. On the 9th of March 1922, Karl walked down to Funchal in cold weather to buy a toy for one of his sons. He caught a chill. It became bronchitis. It became pneumonia. He could not afford a doctor. He suffered 2 heart attacks. On the 1st of April 1922, aged 34, he died in the loaned bedroom in the presence of his pregnant wife and his 9-year-old son, Otto. His last words to Zita, recorded in her memoirs, were, "I love you so much." In 2004, Pope John Paul II beatified him. The last emperor of Austria is officially, in the Catholic Church, Blessed Karl. His grandson was permitted to run for the presidency of Austria only in 2011, after the constitution was finally amended. 92 years after the Habsburg Law was passed, the family became legally citizens again. Karl I lost his name by legislation. The next emperor lost his by preference, and the name he preferred was the one on his baptismal certificate, as if the 58 years he had spent as emperor of the largest country in the Americas had been the disguise. Number 3 begins on the night of the 15th of November 1889 in the Paço Imperial in Rio de Janeiro, where a 64-year-old man in a dressing gown is handed a note by a servant. The note informs him that the army has declared a republic and that his family has been given 24 hours to leave Brazil. His response, preserved in the diaries of those present, is spoken calmly to no one in particular. If it is so, it will be my retirement. He had ruled Brazil since he was 14. History calls him Dom Pedro II. He had made Brazil in his own image. 6 languages, personal correspondence with Victor Hugo, Louis Pasteur, Alexander Graham Bell. He had introduced the telephone to South America. He had presided over the abolition of slavery in 1888. He was probably the most learned monarch alive. He was also, privately, ready to leave. His son and heir had died in infancy. He no longer believed the monarchy had a future. The coup was almost bloodless. Pedro and his family boarded the warship Alagoas on the 17th of November and sailed to Lisbon, where the Empress Teresa Cristina, his wife of 46 years, died of heart failure 5 weeks later. She never recovered from the exile. Pedro moved on to Paris alone. He took rooms at the Hotel Bedford, a discreet family-run establishment in the 8th arrondissement near the Madeleine. He signed the register as Pedro de Alcantara. It was his baptismal name, without any imperial style attached. He had used it throughout his reign whenever he traveled privately in Europe, whenever he wanted to be a scholar in a library instead of an emperor in a state visit. Now, for the first time in his life, it was the only name he had. His life at the Bedford settled into a routine that would have belonged to any elderly professor. He read at the Bibliothèque Nationale. He attended lectures at the Sorbonne. The Brazilian government granted him a pension of 200,000 francs a year. He refused it. He sold his personal library instead. He took a long, cold carriage ride along the Seine on the 23rd of November, 1891. He returned chilled. The chill became bronchitis. The bronchitis became pneumonia. He died at 35 minutes past midnight on the 5th of December, 1891, 3 days after his 66th birthday. When his body was being prepared, the Count of Eu found a sealed package on the nightstand. Attached to it was a note in Pedro's own handwriting. "It is soil from my country. I wish it to be placed in my coffin in case I die away from my fatherland." Inside was earth collected from every Brazilian province. The Hotel Bedford is still open. It is still family-owned. Ordinary tourists walk past his door without knowing. His body was returned to Brazil in 1921, 30 years after his death, when the Republic had grown insecure enough to admit it wanted him back. Number 2 begins on the morning of the 13th of June, 1946, at Ciampino Airfield outside Rome, where a 41-year-old man in a general's uniform boards a Savoia Marchetti aircraft bound for Portugal. His name is Umberto II. He is the King of Italy. He has been king for 34 days. The Italian people have just voted, by referendum, to become a republic. He is flying into exile before he has finished unpacking. History remembers him as Il Re di Maggio, the May King. Umberto had inherited the throne on the 9th of May 1946 from his father, Victor Emmanuel III, who had abdicated in a last attempt to save the monarchy from the taint of Mussolini. The maneuver did not work. On the 2nd of June, Italians voted 12.7 million to 10.7 million for a republic. The Constituent Assembly passed a law banning Umberto and his male heirs from ever setting foot in Italy again. He never abdicated. He believed the referendum had been manipulated. He simply stopped being king because the state stopped being a monarchy underneath him. He landed in Portugal and settled in Cascais, on the Atlantic coast near Lisbon, in a villa called Villa Italia. It was not his. It was made available to him by the Portuguese government, which had a soft policy toward exiled European royalty. He took the incognito title Count of Sare, after the medieval castle of Sara in the Aosta Valley, a Savoy family property that had also been confiscated by the new Italian Republic. For 37 years he lived in Cascais as the Count of Sara. He signed his correspondence that way. His household staff addressed him that way in public. Only his loyalists still called him Majesty, and only in private. His marriage collapsed under the pressure of exile. His wife, Marie José, moved to Switzerland. Umberto remained in Cascais with his daughters for the next 3 decades, watching his country from a distance and refusing every offer to return as a private citizen. In early 1983, gravely ill with cancer, he traveled to Geneva for treatment. He died there on the 18th of March 1983, aged 78, in a clinical bed far from the villa in Cascais that had housed him for most of his adult life. He was buried at Hautecombe Abbey in Savoy, the ancestral burial place of his house, which happens to sit inside French territory. The last king of Italy is buried in France, using a title that pointed to a castle the Italian Republic had taken from his family. His grandson, Emanuele Filiberto, was allowed to visit Italy for the first time in 2002, after the Italian constitution was amended to lift the ban on male Savoys. 56 years after Umberto boarded the plane at Ciampino, the family was finally permitted to come home. Umberto himself never did. Umberto II died under a false title in a foreign clinic. The last emperor on this list wanted the same kind of ending. He had picked the name. He had booked the passage. He never got there. Number 1 begins in a study at Malmaison, west of Paris, on the 29th of June, 1815, 11 days after Waterloo. The man at the desk is 45 years old. He has ruled France as emperor twice. He has crowned himself in Notre Dame with a crown he took from the Pope's hands. He has commanded armies from Madrid to Moscow. Now he is packing books about American geography into a traveling case. He has abdicated for the second time in his life. The Prussians are advancing on Paris. He has decided to go to the United States. On the manifest of the ship he plans to board at Rochefort, he has requested a passport in a name that is not his. The name is Colonel Muiron. Jean-Baptiste Muiron had been his aide-de-camp in Italy in 1796. At the Battle of Arcola, Napoleon had led a charge across a bridge under Austrian fire. The line broke. Napoleon fell into the muddy canal. Muiron threw himself between his commander and the Austrian muskets and was killed. He was 22 years old. Napoleon carried the memory of him for the next 19 years. He named a frigate after him. And now, at the moment of choosing a false name to carry into a new life on another continent, he chose the name of the man who had died so that he could live. He reached Rochefort. 2 French frigates were waiting, but the British Navy was blockading the harbor. His brother Joseph offered to change places with him. They looked enough alike. Napoleon considered it and refused. On the 15th of July, 1815, he wrote a letter to the British Prince Regent asking for asylum in England. He compared himself to Themistocles, seeking sanctuary at the court of his enemies. He boarded HMS Bellerophon. The British did not treat the letter as a request for asylum. They treated it as a surrender. He was transferred to HMS Northumberland. On the 17th of October, 1815, he was deposited on the volcanic island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, 1,200 miles from the coast of Africa. He would not leave. He was taken to Longwood House on a windswept plateau. It was damp. It smelled of rats. It was the property of the British government, garrisoned by British troops, maintained by the Royal Navy. Napoleon was assigned to it as a prisoner in a state-provided residence. Governor Sir Hudson Lowe arrived in 1816 with orders to address the prisoner as General Bonaparte. Napoleon refused to answer to it. He would only respond to Emperor. Lowe would not use that. Letters went unread because they were addressed to General Bonaparte, and Napoleon returned them unopened. For 5 years there was no name both sides could agree to use. His health deteriorated. From late 1820, he could no longer keep food down. On the 5th of May, 1821, in the dining room at Longwood converted into a bedroom, Napoleon died. He was 51. Stomach cancer is the medical consensus. He was buried on St. Helena in a small green valley called the Valley of the Willows, which he had chosen himself because he liked the shade. When the funeral party reached the question of what to put on the tombstone, the argument that had run for 5 years erupted again. The French wanted the single word, Napoleon. The British insisted on Napoleon Bonaparte. Neither side would yield. The compromise was to inscribe nothing. The stone above his grave was left blank. Sigiet, said a marker in French. Here lies. Here lies who? The tombstone did not say. For 19 years, the most famous man in Europe was buried under a stone with no name on it. In 1840, King Louis Philippe, sitting in the Tuileries 7 years before he would flee Paris as Mr. Smith, negotiated the return of the body. The coffin was exhumed and carried to Paris and interred at Les Invalides beneath the dome, where every French schoolchild is now taken at least once to look at it. The letters are gold, the name is complete. But the valley on St. Helena is still there. The empty grave is still marked. The blank tombstone sits above a hole in the ground that has been empty for 186 years, marked only with the words, "Here lies," followed by silence. The name Napoleon had chosen for himself was Murat. He never used it. He never signed a hotel register with it. He never wrote it on a passport. The Bellerophon intercepted the plan before it could become his life. So for the last 5 years of his life, and for 19 years after his death, he lived and lay under no name at all. The emperor who had chosen the tenderest false name in this entire story was the only one who did not get to use it. 8 men, 8 rooms, 8 names. James II, dying in a French royal palace as an English king no English document would recognize. Charles VI, dying of cholera in a borrowed Austrian palace as the count of a French county he did not own. Napoleon III, dying of failed surgery in a rented English country house as a private British resident. Louis Philippe, dying of old age in a Surrey estate lent by a foreign queen, styled as the count of a suburb whose chateau had been burned. Karl I, dying of pneumonia at 34 in a mountain villa on Madeira, his name legally erased by an act of parliament. Pedro II, dying in a Paris hotel that is still open today, signed into the register as Pedro de Alcantara. Umberto II, dying in a Geneva clinic as the Count of Sarre, a castle the Italian Republic had already taken from his family. And Napoleon, dying under no name at all on a volcanic rock in the middle of the Atlantic, with the name of a friend who had died for him folded away inside a plan that never happened. Their real names are on coins, on streets, on statues. History gave every one of them their name back once they were beyond needing it, but the last name each of them actually wrote, or was addressed by, or was permitted to keep, was the false one. They were kings and emperors when they were born, and kings and emperors again when the world remembered them. But every one of them, at the moment they died, was signing in as somebody else,